Okay, we should be good. We should be recording now. All right, so y'all have a quiz today. Um, so we're starting our, fourth unit, right? The unit number 4. This is, so basically I've titled this unit Jacksonian Democracy, right? So we went through Jeffersonian democracy, now we're gonna go through Jacksonian democracy. And again, there's, I mean, I don't know, maybe this is just because I'm a government teacher and I'm a politics guy too, why I'm sort of covering them as or naming them after presidents. But obviously we got to cover some other aspects too. So this is a little pre-Jackson, right? Because Jackson doesn't become president until 1828, okay? But some of the things that we need to make sure we understand. So we went over sort of in the last unit, we went over the beginnings of a sort of market economy and sort of early capitalism in the United States. I need you to also understand sort of the next wave of nationalism within the United States. And I think we talked about the concept that nationalism is going to be a recurring theme. Yes? No? Did I mention this? I did? Okay. Nationalism is something that will occur over and over and over again. Following the War of 1812, we had an increase in nationalism. What's up? I've got it in the D2L module named as Jacksonian democracy. Just because, again, Jackson is, and I think we talked about this concept, Jackson's one of like 5 or 6 presidents that you absolutely have to understand in terms of history. You need to understand him in terms of government too. But from a government standpoint, you really only need to know like 2. You have to know Jackson and you have to know FDR. But from a U.S. history perspective, I mean, am I lying, Michaela? Those are like the only 2 you remember from my class last year, right? Jackson and FDR. Yeah, because that's I mean that's it. That's all you really have to know. All right. So the War of 1812, which we already covered, we covered it a couple of chapters ago actually, is sometimes referred to as the Second War of Independence. Right? We're fighting the British again, and we're fighting them over a variety of reasons that I'm not really going to go through. But it does lead to sort of a resurgence of nationalism or a boost in nationalism, like rah rah America, okay? Which is going to happen frequently around times of war. One of the things that this nationalism creates, though, is what can be referred to as economic nationalism. Okay, and so again, this is the very, very beginnings of sort of our market economy and capitalism within the United States. And so we have like trade embargoes that go into place that are seeking to promote American growth, right? So American industrial growth. So trade embargoes, an embargo is where you stop trade, right? Or you eliminate or you put caps on the amount of trade. And the U.S. is doing this because, again, we talked about this early in the American history. The United States is exporting raw goods, right, and importing finished products, and that is not a recipe for how to create wealth, okay? And if you don't understand that, simply look at Africa, right? Because Africa, pretty much its whole existence has been economically exploited by having its raw goods taken, right, and then finished products sent back. Okay, so the United States, this embargo, this economic nationalism is an intent to try to look inward. Okay, one of the things that you need to understand about capitalism ebbs and flows. It's natural within capitalism. When I say ebb and flow, I mean you're going to have peaks and valleys within the capitalistic structure. If you've taken an economics class, you would understand this concept. All right, but it's a very, very normal occurrence. Government does aim to combat that. We're not going to cover that in a great deal right now. But one of the things that you need to understand is we had the first Bank of the United States that was created under like Alexander Hamilton and the founders. Okay, because the United States was capable of doing what the United States was capable of doing, and so we have the first bank of the United States. We let it die, right? So a significant amount of legislation and things that government does, right? A significant amount of it has something called a sunset clause. A sunset clause simply means we're doing it just like the sun, right? We're doing it, we're doing it, we're doing it. The sun goes down and it's gone. Okay. The first bank of the United States basically had the same thing, and we allowed it to die, right? We did not renew the charter for it. And ultimately that becomes problematic. Okay. And so we're going to create a second Bank of the United States in order to try to fix some of the economic difficulties that were around for a few years between these. So I think if memory serves, it's like 1811. Because I think it was 1791 when they created the first Bank of the United States, and it was chartered for 20 years. And then the second Bank of the United States is 1816, and it's chartered for 20 years. And next aspect of nationalism is protective tariff. Anybody know what a tariff is? Exactly, a tax on imported goods. Wonderful. What do tariffs do? And so what is the goal? There you go, right? So it's a basic concept, right? It's something that you might, if you follow politics today, right? Donald Trump is engaged in sort of like tariff wars as a means of trying to manipulate the economy. Okay, so the United States creates protective tariffs that are trying to ensure that northern manufacturing is competitive in an open market, right? Because when you are an importer, right, like you're importing British cotton or British linens, right? Because it's not cotton, right? It's the finished product. And then you get an import tax on that. Like you don't just eat the tax, you up the cost of your good in order to offset that tax cost. Okay? And American products, because the startup capital is extensive for business, their products are more expensive because of the costs, the startup costs. Okay? By creating the tariff, you're trying to increase the cost of foreign goods, and that in turn will make American goods competitive in the open market, right? And then finally, the War of 1812 sort of shows that we need to make internal improvements, right? And this is called infrastructure. Infrastructure is things like roads and sewers and telephone lines and all of those things that we think of today that the government is sort of responsible for, because obviously you understand, like, you don't build your own sewer, right? Like you don't build your own roads. Okay. The War of 1812 makes us realize relatively quickly that we need some improvements in terms of transportation specifically, right? We need transportation improvement so we can move around, right? This is a painting, or it's a depiction of meat markets. This is the meat market one. Yeah, meat in New York, Philadelphia, I forget where, Boston, some large New England city. I don't really care about the city, but it's aimed at sort of promoting, again, like American business, American ingenuity, and the fact that we're capable of sustaining ourselves, right? Creation of a national railroad. Again, this is infrastructure, this is transportation. Okay, we're trying to bring East and West together, and we'll talk about this again before the end of this semester, because we'll see, and I think we saw it in the last chapter too, right? The massive increases in transportation, because transportation allows for economic growth. What's up?
Is that just like a regular road? Is that a
Railroad. No, that's a regular road. That was a regular road. Sorry. So this is basically the United States clearing like trees and creating a national road. There were around this time, there were some attempts at like private roads. But then in order to offset the cost, like if you're a private person and you build a private road and you're gonna allow the public to use it, right? You would charge the public in order to use it, kind of like a toll road, right? Which isn't really effective because there's not a lot of incentive for upkeep and things like that. But yeah, so this is like the first sort of highway.
Why did it say 1811 to 1838? They're like, did they stop using it or something?
No. This was just the creation of it, right?
So that's how long it took to build?
Yeah, God, yeah. I mean, you got to think, like, we don't have like bulldozers and things like that at this time, right? So you're literally going out there and like clearing trees, and you have to realize that like this part of the world or the U.S. at the time is forest essentially, and so clearing all of these trees would have taken significant time and effort and energy, and so it was not something that was done relatively easily. Right. Additionally, you're talking about going over the Ohio River right here, and so you're does that go up into? No, that doesn't go up into Pittsburgh. Pittsburgh is right there where those three rivers meet. But this is the Ohio River, which comes down here and runs into the Mississippi. Like this, it's the Ohio River is a wide river, right? And so you either have to build like ferries. Right, so where you have like a little dock and a ferry that's going to ferry people back and forth, or you have to build bridges, which is fairly extensive. And you're also talking about this being the Appalachian Mountain region through here. So you're talking about having to cut through mountains and create roads that are into mountainsides and hillsides and things like that. Right. Again, which is why part of the reason why it takes so long. Judicial nationalism. So John Marshall is not the first Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, but he is sort of considered to be the father or the grandfather of the Supreme Court, depending on how you look at it. John Marshall is he was, I don't know if he still is. He probably, no, he still is because John Roberts hasn't been around that long. But John Marshall is the longest serving Chief Justice in U.S. Supreme Court history. He was the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court for nearly 40 years, I believe. And during his tenure, he's going to do all sorts of things to strengthen the national government, strengthen the judiciary, regulate interstate commerce, try to create opportunity for economic gain or economic growth, protecting contract rights, things like that. He's going to extend the powers of the national government, a lot of times at the expense of the state government. But he's doing so in order to try to ensure that the national government wields enough power that it's going to be able to last, even if states were no longer sort of okay with what the national government was doing. There's probably two cases that you really need to know as it pertains to John Marshall. The first is Marbury versus Madison in 1803. Marbury versus Madison, John Marshall establishes the doctrine or the legal precedent of judicial review. There are people today, libertarians and some sort of like Tea Party type Republicans who view Marshall very negatively. They see Marshall as somebody who overreached and extended the power of the national government unjustly. I will say this, if you go back and read all the Federalist Papers, and this is again something that you'll get to in government class, If you were to read the Federalist Papers, you would understand that judicial review was sort of understood before John Marshall goes and officially creates the concept in 1803 in Marbury versus Madison. So I don't think it's a gross overreach on the judiciary's part. The second case that you really need to know, though, is McCulloch versus Maryland, which is there's a supremacy clause case in which Marshall is going to decide that the national government can essentially do whatever it wants in order to fulfill its duties, even if that's at the expense of the states. If there was a third one you needed to know, Gibbons v. Ogden probably isn't a bad one to understand because it's an interstate commerce issue. And early on, the national government is going to sort of heavy-handedly regulate interstate commerce. We will get to a point in time much later in U.S.'s history, like sort of modern judicial history, where we realize that the Commerce Clause has probably been overextended in American history. I think did we talk about the creation of the steamboat in the last chapter, right? Because those transportation advances are relatively significant. So this is just a depiction of a steamboat on the Hudson River. And the Hudson River is what runs out of New York City, excuse me, north into upstate New York. Well, actually, it flows south because it's water. You understand what I'm saying, right? The steamboat is going north against the current. The current is going south. What?
How much did those cost?
Steamboats?
Yeah.
Oh God, I have no idea. They would not have been cheap. They would not have been cheap, but they would have also.
So like business owners will usually people who own them?
Probably not. So if you look, actually nobody's ever asked me this about steamboats, but if you look at the railroads, for instance, railroads were basically owned by individuals. Okay, and then those individuals created contracts with other businessmen in order to like ship goods. I would assume, and now I'm just making an assumption because I've not looked this up. I would assume most steamboats were probably the same, right? And think about it in terms of like modern day, right? You have all sorts of businesses today that transport goods all over the country, but they don't have, I mean, outside of Amazon, they don't have their own delivery services.
So like steamboats would be like the barges that carry containers.
Correct. Or think in a modern day sense, think about them as FedEx, right? Like the steamboats and the railroads would be FedEx and UPS transporting other people's goods, right? We'll get to this eventually, but Sears, like y'all know, I mean, Sears is kind of going out of business now, but y'all know what Sears is, the department store, right? Like Sears became a massive corporation in the late 1800s because of its investment with and contracts with the railroad. Like they were the first sort of Amazon. They like sent catalogs out to people, and then you could just order stuff from Sears via catalog, and they would use the railroads to ship it, right? Which is kind of genius. The American system, so the American economic system doesn't come without some controversy. There's all sorts of governmental actions that are enacted during this period of time, but they're not always wildly popular. Some of these things are sort of seen as controversial. The picture here is Henry Clay, who is a senator. I'm pretty sure he was a senator from Kentucky. He might have been, no, I'm pretty sure he was a senator. He might have been in the House of Representatives before that point in time, but he made his name as a senator from Kentucky. He's the one that basically comes up with this sort of idea or coins the term the American system, which is going to, again, create these tariffs governmental behaviors that boost economic activity, creation of a bank, like all of these things that we just talked about is sort of the idea of the American system that is going to allow the government to take an active role in sort of the promotion of economic welfare. What's up?
So when it says initiative, it means like tariffs and stuff, I'm guessing?
Initiatives would be more than just tariffs. So initiatives would, like these other things would fall under it, the creation of a national bank, the infrastructure improvements, because those are things that help as well, like the trade embargo, the tariffs. I don't think the government went so far as to provide like things that we do today, like small business loans and things of that nature. I don't think the government was going to that extent at the time, but they were helping companies get charters and land and figure out ways to build factories or textile mills or things like that, all as a means of trying to promote economic welfare, right? The era of good feelings. So Monroe is our last founding father. Monroe becomes president of the United States in 1817. And when he takes over, again, we've had some ebbs and flows with the economy in the U.S. Monroe took over a fairly good economy. We did have a panic that was a result of like some cotton prices dropping and some issues with production. That's really probably the Panic of 1819 can probably really be seen as the first depressive period in American economics. Prices of cotton dropped in reality as a result of sort of market conditions. So if you understand the market, when you have overproduction, right? Now producers, and there's a whole, you'll learn this when you get to economics, right? But there's like a supply and demand chart, right? The more you supply, right, the more the suppliers want the cost to go up, right? And the less the supply, the higher demanders are willing to pay. And so it looks like a little X, and then there have a point of equilibrium. Well, then there's things that shift that equilibrium point. So if you have increases in production, right, now the supply has gone up, that causes prices to go down. And so there's actually, and we'll talk about this again later on in this, actually this might be next semester. But there's all sorts of instances in which farmers, agriculture in particular, they lose out as a result of overproduction. And there's some instances in which farmers, the crop prices drop so low that they ultimately lose money growing food, right? Because you have to buy seeds and fertilizer and mills and tractors and things like that. Like all of those costs that go into farming aren't offset by the cost by the profits of your crop, right? And so farmers actually lose money. And so that's sort of one of the issues there. The era of good feelings is the end of, or it's the down. Let's call it the downfall. I don't want to say it's the end of, because in reality, Monroe serves 2 terms, right? So 1816 he's elected, 1820 he's reelected. He gets out after 8 years, and then in 1824. And we'll learn this in the next chapter because we'll talk about Jackson in detail in the next chapter. 1824 is still the Democratic Republicans running against one another. The era of good feelings is this sort of single party dominance in American political history, which doesn't really happen, right? The Missouri Compromise of 1821. So there's a balance up until this point in the number of states enslaved states versus free states. And slavery obviously is a huge issue. It's been a contentious issue in the United States since the foundation of the United States. You have states like Vermont that outlaw slavery in the state of Vermont as early as 1790 something, right? They need it less. I wouldn't say that you don't need it. I mean, like, let's be honest. If you could own a slave, right, like, you could find a use for it, right? And I mean, you take the human out of it, because obviously there's all sorts of like moral implications for that, right? But if we have the technological advancements now for you to have like a humanoid, artificial intelligence robot that could do all sorts of mundane tasks for you, would you be able to find enough tasks for it? God, yes, right? Even in Vermont, where you don't necessarily need them to be out there like plowing fields and planting seeds, you could still find enough cause for labor, and specifically for free labor, because if you have to have labor, why wouldn't you rather have free labor? But the Missouri Compromise allows Missouri to come into the Union as a slave state, right? And if you look at the map right here above Michaela, the 10 right here is Missouri, right? So it's on the high side of sort of the Mason-Dixon line and what constitutes northern versus southern states, right? But the compromise is, in addition to Missouri entering as a slave state, Maine enters the United States as a free state, because at the time, Maine was actually a part of Massachusetts, which is fascinating because it means that Massachusetts was non-contiguous. It means that it wasn't connected all the way, right? That you had Massachusetts here, and then, let's steady my hand, Massachusetts here, and then this is New Hampshire, and then this is Maine. And so you would draw, and like if you were on a horse, because obviously we didn't have cars yet, right? But you were in Massachusetts and you got on horseback and you went north, you'd go into New Hampshire. And then if you went north further, you would get back into Massachusetts, right? Yeah, it's a little weird. And so Maine becomes a state as a part of the Missouri Compromise. But then the Missouri Compromise also creates a line, 3630 parallel. I've got it in my notes here. The 3630 parallel that says you cannot have slavery above this line. And most of the southern states, they were kind of okay with it at the time. But what you need to understand is the Missouri Compromise is simply the first of multiple sort of band-aids on a massive, massive wound, right? I mean, if you really think about it, like the United States has been stabbed, and we're basically putting like a piece of like duct tape over the wound, trying to hold like the two sides together. It's ultimately not going to work, especially as you continue to move forward. All right. So this is a map of the Missouri Compromise, right? So there's Missouri, Maine comes in. All of this is unorganized territory. This all belongs to Spain at the moment, but we'll take that back soon, or take that soon. And then this is disputed as to whether or not it's British or American, right? Some boundaries and treaties, right? So Adams-Onis Treaty of 1819, the Spanish give up Florida. Yeah. The Spanish give up Florida, so the United States is going to get Florida as a part of this treaty, and then we create sort of a specific boundary here, and the 42nd parallel becomes an issue there. But the Adams-Onis Treaty is a treaty with the Spanish. All right, some national diplomacy around the time. So again, the War of 1812 is somewhat problematic. It's the Second American Revolution, essentially. Okay, so our relations with Britain, ironically, they probably should have been a lot worse than what they were. I mean, basically, we fight them for our independence in 1776, and they let us become independent, and then we become sort of friends relatively quickly. And then they fight us again in 1812 because they kept impressing our sailors. And then relatively quickly, we become friends with them again. And so we create some treaties like the Rush-Bagot Treaty is a means of trying to limit militarism amongst the American and British navies. Because militarism, everybody in here taking world history? Yes, you know, militarism is like the #1 cause of World War I, right? I mean, in reality, militarism is not really a good thing. And so they're trying to end like an arms race at this point. And the Convention of 1818 is trying to solve this issue up here, right? And this is the 49th parallel, like what is or is not sort of American versus British. So if you actually look at like a map of the United States today, again, if you were to look behind Michaela here, you would see that basically from the extension of like the Great Lakes, right? We have almost a straight line border, although ironically there's a little like peninsula from Minnesota that got a little confusing, right? But it like pops up and then goes back down. But this is again an issue we had with the British over who controls what, right? The extension of boundaries. So the Adams-Onis Treaty gets us Florida and some other issues. You have the Oregon Treaty that's going to try to determine what we're doing with the British below the 49th parallel. And then the Monroe Doctrine ultimately becomes really important because this is sort of nationalistic diplomacy. The United States essentially looks at European countries, the French, the Spanish, the Portuguese, the English, all of them, and says, listen, y'all can do whatever you want in the Eastern Hemisphere, right? But we control the Western Hemisphere. Okay? Meaning that the Americas, both North and South, are really sort of the property or the responsibility of the United States. Okay? We do have some ongoing issues, obviously. So when we Florida, right? The Adams-Onis Treaty, when we obtained Florida, the Spanish had not settled it extensively yet at this point. And there were still a large number of Native American tribes. And so we're going to end up not under Monroe, but rather under Andrew Jackson, dealing with the Native American issue, the indigenous populations, specifically in the newly acquired territories. So again, as the U.S. sort of acquires, and I use that term sort of loosely, because obviously, like, you had a whole bunch of Europeans that were just laying claim to areas and territories and regions where other people were already living. As the U.S. expands its territory in sort of a white man's diplomatic way, they do have issues with natives, and then, you know, freed slaves or runaway slaves or slaves that had tried to escape and got into some opportunities for freedom. Some of the slaves that were more successful basically went and lived amongst Native Americans and sort of assimilated into their cultures, obviously because they were no longer in Africa, and so they didn't have their own culture. The election, so politically around this time, the election of 1824 is the rise of Andrew Jackson as sort of a prominent figure. And Jackson, historically, Jackson is one of the more fascinating sort of men in history. He had sort of a rough childhood. He was a troublemaker growing up. He found success in the military because he was very he needed that discipline, right? And once he found that discipline that the lifestyle of the military provided him, he actually did very well in the military. He's the hero of the Battle of New Orleans in the War of 1812. And so 1824, he runs for president of the United States. And he is sort of the people's champion. I've seen some comparisons between Andrew Jackson and Donald Trump in terms of sort of their appeal to the masses. They were not political elitists. Obviously, up until 1824, we've had a founding father as president of the United States all this time. The guy who ultimately wins in 1824 is John Quincy Adams, son of John Adams, a founding father. So you could make an argument that we have sort of an elitist ruling class that's already occurring around this time. But Jackson becomes sort of a prominent man of the people, for lack of a better term. And 1824 is one of those rare years, you'd learn more about this in a government class, in which there is no victor in the presidential election. No one received a majority of the Electoral College votes. And so it goes to the House of Representatives. And ultimately, the House of Representatives, they're allowed to choose amongst the three leading candidates in the Electoral College. Andrew Jackson had the plurality of the votes. He had received the most votes. But ultimately, John Quincy Adams is supported by the House of Representatives as a somewhat, I mean, Jackson calls it a corrupt bargain because, again, Jackson had the plurality of the most votes. And so he felt that he should win. But obviously, he did not. And just so you understand, when it goes to the House of Representatives, each state gets a single vote. And again, this is just sort of a cartoon depiction of this race, which will change sort of presidential politics vastly in American history. John Quincy Adams, he serves just like his father, one term, right? That's all he gets. So ironically, you have of our first 6 presidents, 4 of them serve 2 terms, and then the Adams boys get 1 term each. Okay. Correct. They were both not reelected. So John Adams was not reelected in 1800, in large part because of the Alien and Sedition Acts, which were free speech violations. But you know, in reality, we had the Constitution for less than a decade when we started violating it, which is terrible, but whatever. John Quincy Adams doesn't get reelected because Andrew Jackson is basically not going to have it. And so the election in 1824, Jackson's going to start mudslinging. It's the first sort of instance of negative campaigning. It's actually really the first instance of campaigning, period. Prior to 1828, presidents didn't seek, and I use that in air quotes, the office of the presidency, right? The sort of tradition is that elitists within the country sort of found the guy that they thought could do the job well, and they sort of rallied around him together, and then they would go and they would be like, Mr. Washington, General Washington, we really need you to be president of the United States. And Washington would be like, yeah, I don't want to do that job. No, I'm good. And they'd be like, no, please, let me go to bed. And then finally the president would relent and he would be like, okay, all right, you can put my name down, like I'll do the job, right? And that's true all the way up until 1824. And then in 1828, because Andrew Jackson still feels like he got cheated, because Jackson is sort of rash and pompous and very emotional, feels like he got cheated. He goes out and actually starts campaigning, right? And so he campaigns as sort of the common man, right? Like Jackson is a man of the people, which again is something you saw with Donald Trump, right? Like y'all understand that? Like even today, there are people right now that are saying, yeah, you got to reelect Donald Trump solely because he's not a politician, right? Because when you look at the other options, right? Hillary Clinton, former first lady, former senator, she's been in politics since Bill was governor of Arkansas in like the late 70s. Like she'd been in politics forever. Joe Biden has served in politics for 40 some odd years, right? Like these are elitists. That's the argument. Andrew Jackson is going against that and basically saying like, look, bro, I'm just like you. I'm a regular person. I'm a regular citizen. I've not been in Congress my whole life and now just expect to become the next president of the United States. Okay? And so it actually works pretty well. And so the election of 1828, Jackson is successful, right? And Jackson has created, really, he creates a new party, right? 1828 is the foundation of what we call the Democratic Party today. And interestingly enough, just a little side note, y'all know what the mascot of the Democratic Party is? It's a donkey. You know what another word for a donkey is? A jackass, right? The reason that the donkey is the mascot of the Democratic Party is because there was a political cartoon aimed at Andrew Jackson that basically showed him as a jackass, as a donkey. And Andrew Jackson was like, fine. You want to try to belittle me like that? I'm gonna take it, I'm gonna use it. That's my new symbol. Because Jackson was not one to back down ever. If you understand his life, right? Jackson's life, he grew up poor, he grew up sort of rough, he grew up sort of country, had a very short temper. He felt like he was shorted a lot of the times. And so he was very combative in the way that he did all sorts of things. He's sort of famous for having dueled a lot. You know what that is? Where they go and like shoot at each other with pistols. He actually didn't duel, but like I think it was 3 times, right? Now he served as a second a number of times. And so he was in duels or involved in duels nearly a dozen times, if I remember correctly. But he was not actually shooting nearly all that often. But Jackson drastically changes the sort of presidential politics, and that's what the next chapter is all about. And that's what's going to be ultimately really, really important for you to understand, because Jackson is a huge, huge shift in U.S. history, right? Just like you have all kinds of people today that are like, Trump is not presidential, right? Like that's a knock on him, right? He's not quote unquote presidential, right? Jackson would have had the exact same sort of statement made against him. And interestingly enough, after Jackson leaves the White House, right after he's done, and he goes and he retires to Tennessee, which is where he spends out his days. When people come and visit him, interestingly enough, he had them address him as General Jackson because of the way he sort of revered the military. He actually thought that earning the title of general in the United States Army was more impressive than earning the title of president, right? And I mean, you think about it, you realize that we still refer to Joe Biden as Mr. Vice President, right? Or Vice President Biden, even though he's not the current vice president, because you generally keep your title. Like we would still refer to Obama as President Obama. Like that's the appropriate, like polite way to refer to him. All right. So that's it. That's the end of this PowerPoint. This gives you some of the ideas of sectionalism and nationalism, and some of the conflicts that are going to give rise to Jacksonian democracy, right? And that's why I put this in Jackson, because obviously these are things that are going to directly influence Andrew Jackson's presidency and what he does. I mean, spoiler alert, like he'll kill the second bank. He's going to engage in all sorts of things that are sort of nationalistic. Again, I think it's wrong to equate Trump to Hitler. which you'll see sometimes in like popular culture. I don't think that that's very accurate. But if you wanted to equate Trump to Andrew Jackson, I think there's some significant parallels that would actually make sense in terms of a historical comparison. All right, so there we go. You've got a quiz tonight.